Every civilization that ever built something lasting did it beside a river. This is not a coincidence of convenience. It is the single most consistent fact in the entire history of human settlement. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and the Ganges, the Yellow River, all of them cradles not just of agriculture, but of the very idea of civilization itself. But here is what almost never gets asked. Why did every single one of these civilizations look at the water that fed them and conclude it was alive? Not metaphorically alive, not poetically alive, but genuinely, literally divine, a being with a name, a personality, a will, capable of anger and generosity, worthy of prayer, sacrifice, and fear. The Egyptians did not simply use the Nile. They worshipped Hapi, the god whose body was the flood itself. The Hindus do not simply bathe in the Ganges. They bathe in Ganga, a goddess who fell from heaven and agreed to be caught in the hair of a god so her descent would not shatter the earth. And when these civilizations needed to describe the boundary between the world of the living and whatever comes after, again and again, independently, they reached for the same image: a river you must cross and cannot cross back. Why water? Why, out of every element available to the human imagination, did the boundary between life and death, between purity and defilement, between the sacred and the ordinary, get drawn specifically at the edge of moving water? Begin in Egypt, where the relationship between a civilization and its river reached a level of totalizing dependency and reverence that later cultures would echo but rarely match. The Nile does not merely support Egyptian civilization. For the ancient Egyptians, it was Egyptian civilization. In the most literal sense, the Egyptians themselves understood it. The fertile black land, Kemet, that gave the country its name, existed only within the narrow band the river's annual flood could reach, beyond which lay the Red Land, Deshret, the barren desert where nothing grew and where chaos, in the form of the god Set, was understood to hold dominion. The flood itself was not attributed to rainfall, which the Egyptians rarely saw and did not fully understand as the flood's true distant source, but to the god Hapi, depicted with a swollen belly and pendulous breasts, suggesting both male and female fertility simultaneously, pouring water from vessels held in each hand, celebrated in hymns that addressed him directly as the one who waters the meadows, who makes every soul rejoice, who fills the storehouses and swells the granaries. Temples all along the Nile maintained nilometers, carefully calibrated stone structures for precisely measuring the flood's height each year, because the entire economic and taxation system of Egypt depended on knowing, with real accuracy, whether the coming harvest would be abundant, adequate, or catastrophically insufficient. A flood too low meant famine. A flood too high meant destroyed villages and washed-out canals, and the correct, moderate flood was itself understood as a direct expression of Hapi's favor, requiring hymns, offerings, and ritual attention to secure. What is philosophically significant here is the totality of the identification. Egyptian civilization did not simply depend on the Nile the way a farmer depends on rain. It understood itself as a direct, physical extension of the river's generosity, a strip of fertile order surviving specifically and only within the reach of a god's annual, life-giving overflow, with the desert on either side standing as permanent, visible proof of what existence looked like beyond that divine reach. In India, the relationship between a civilization and its sacred river takes an even more direct and personal theological form, because the Ganges is not merely a god's gift in the way the Nile channels Hapi's favor. The Ganges is understood throughout Hindu tradition to be a goddess herself, Ganga, whose descent to earth is told in one of the most beloved narratives in the entire Hindu textual tradition. According to the account preserved in the Ramayana and elaborated across Puranic literature, the ancient king Bhagirath performed extraordinary austerities to persuade Ganga to descend from heaven to earth, needed specifically to purify the ashes of his ancestors and release their souls into proper afterlife. But Ganga's descent posed a genuine cosmic problem. Her full force, falling directly from heaven to earth, threatened to shatter the planet entirely under the sheer weight and power of her flow. The god Shiva agreed to intervene, catching the descending goddess in the matted locks of his own hair, breaking the force of her fall and allowing her to reach the earth gently, in manageable, life-giving streams rather than as planet-destroying deluge. This myth encodes something genuinely distinctive about the Hindu theology of sacred water. The Ganges is not simply useful, and not simply divine in the abstract sense that many things in Hindu cosmology are understood to be divine. She is understood to be so powerful in her unmediated form that she required the direct intervention of one of the tradition's supreme deities merely to become survivable contact for the physical world. This is why bathing in the Ganges is understood across Hindu practice, not merely as ritual cleansing in the ordinary sense, but as direct contact with a being whose full power had to be deliberately, divinely restrained for human beings to approach her at all, and why, to this day, millions of pilgrims travel to bathing ghats along her banks, particularly at Varanasi, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, specifically to wash away accumulated sin, and why cremated remains are traditionally released into her waters, in the conviction that Ganga's touch, even in the smallest quantity, meaningfully assists the soul's onward journey. In Mesopotamia, where the flood mythology already examined elsewhere in this survey establishes water as a fundamentally ambivalent force, capable of both catastrophic destruction and life-sustaining fertility, the Tigris and Euphrates occupied a theological position considerably more anxious than either the Nile or the Ganges, precisely because Mesopotamian rivers were dramatically less predictable than Egypt's carefully calibrated, generally reliable, annual flood. Fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains of Anatolia and Armenia, rather than by predictable monsoon patterns, the Tigris and Euphrates could flood catastrophically and with little warning at unpredictable times of year, destroying entire settlements with a violence the Nile rarely, if ever, displayed. This unpredictability is directly reflected in Mesopotamian water theology, where Hapi and Ganga are figures of consistent generosity, requiring gratitude and correct ritual attention. The god Enki, lord of the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean believed to underlie the entire earth and to be the ultimate source of all rivers, springs, and underground water, is a considerably more ambiguous figure, associated simultaneously with wisdom, magic, freshwater's life-giving properties, and a persistent undertone of unpredictability befitting the genuinely unpredictable rivers his domain governed. Sumerian cities invested enormous, continuous labor in canal construction, dredging, and flood management, specifically because their rivers could not simply be trusted, the way Egyptian farmers could largely trust the Nile's broadly reliable rhythm, and this practical uncertainty runs directly through Mesopotamian religious literature, where water appears again and again as a force requiring careful, anxious management rather than simple, grateful reception. The Greek tradition takes the theology of sacred water in an entirely different direction, locating its most philosophically consequential river not in the world of the living at all, but at the absolute boundary between life and death. The Styx, according to Hesiod's theogony, is a river of such cosmic significance that the gods themselves swear their most binding, unbreakable oaths upon it. Zeus dispatches the goddess Iris to fetch water from the Styx, specifically when a divine oath requires the highest possible guarantee, because a god who swears falsely on the Styx's water, according to Hesiod, falls into a death-like stupor for an entire year, and is then cast out from the company of the gods for 9 additional years, a punishment severe enough that the mere threat of invoking it functions as Olympus's ultimate guarantee of truthfulness. For mortals, The Styx and its companion rivers of the underworld, including Lethe, whose waters grant forgetting, drunk by souls before reincarnation to erase the memory of their previous life, and its accumulated sorrows mark the literal, uncrossable boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, ferried across by Charon in exchange for the coin traditionally placed in the mouths of the properly buried dead, a detail already examined in relation to the broader mythology of the underworld. What is philosophically distinctive about the Greek river boundary is its combination with the specific mechanism of forgetting. Lethe does not merely mark a spatial boundary the way a wall or gate might. It actively, chemically erases what came before, so that crossing the water is not simply a transition in location, but a transition in identity itself, the self on one side of the river genuinely, irreversibly discontinuous from whatever crosses to the other side. In Japan, Buddhist tradition imported and transformed this river boundary concept into the Sanzu no Kawa, the river of three crossings, understood as the waterway souls must traverse 3 days after death on their journey through the intermediate state toward eventual judgment and rebirth. Unlike the singular, uniform crossing of the Greek Styx, the Sanzu River offers 3 distinct crossing points, corresponding directly to the moral weight of the deceased's earthly life. Those who lived with great virtue cross via a jeweled bridge, requiring no difficulty or danger at all. Those whose lives were morally mixed must wade through a shallow, manageable ford, and those who lived with serious wrongdoing must swim through a deep, current-racked, serpent-infested crossing, considerably more hazardous than either of the other 2 paths. An old woman and old man, Datsuba and Kaneo, wait at the river's edge, specifically to strip the clothing from the dead, with Datsuba then hanging each garment on a tree branch whose bend and sag under the weight of the cloth is read as a direct physical measurement of the deceased's accumulated sins, integrating economic metaphor payment, toll, weighing directly into the river crossing mythology in a manner distinct from, though thematically resonant with, the judgment scenes already examined in Egyptian and other underworld traditions. Japanese funerary practice historically responded to this mythology with direct, practical countermeasures. The dead were traditionally buried with 6 coins, 1 for each of the 6 paths of Buddhist rebirth, intended specifically to pay the toll for using the easier ford rather than attempting the dangerous, difficult crossing, a direct, transactional continuation of the same coin for passage logic already visible in the Greek tradition of paying charon, arrived at independently by a civilization with no direct contact with archaic Greece. The Abrahamic tradition locates its most consequential sacred river not primarily at the boundary between life and death, but at the boundary between one form of covenantal existence and another, making the Jordan River the site of 2 of the most theologically decisive crossings in the entire biblical narrative. In the book of Joshua, the Israelites cross the Jordan to enter the Promised Land only after the river's flow is miraculously halted, the waters piling up in a heap upstream, while the riverbed dries sufficiently for the entire nation to cross on dry ground. An event the text explicitly frames as a deliberate echo of the earlier parting of the Red Sea, establishing the Jordan crossing as a second land-based exodus, completing the first sea-based one, and marking the definitive transition from a wandering wilderness people to a settled, land-possessing nation. Centuries later, in the New Testament, the same river becomes the site of John the Baptist's ministry and, specifically, the baptism of Jesus, an event during which, according to the Gospel accounts, the heavens opened, the Spirit descended like a dove, and a divine voice declared approval of the Son, establishing the Jordan permanently within Christian tradition as the paradigmatic site of ritual purification and spiritual rebirth. The physical model for the baptismal rite subsequently performed using ordinary water anywhere in the world, as a direct theological reenactment of that specific river crossing. What unites the Joshua crossing and the baptism of Jesus, despite their considerable historical and theological distance from each other, is the underlying structural logic they share. In both cases, the Jordan functions specifically as a threshold, marking the end of one identity and the beginning of another. Wilderness wanderer becoming land possessor, ordinary person becoming spiritually reborn, with the water itself serving as the necessary physical medium through which that transformation must pass. In the Celtic world, sacred water took a form considerably less centered on a single iconic river and more distributed across an enormous number of individual sacred springs, wells, and smaller waterways, each frequently associated with its own specific local deity or spirit, a pattern for which archaeology provides unusually direct physical confirmation rather than relying primarily on later, often Christianized literary sources. The river Seine in Gaul was personified as the goddess Sequana, whose sanctuary near the river's source, excavated by archaeologists at Fontes Sequanae, yielded literally thousands of votive offerings, carved wooden and later stone representations of afflicted body parts, evidently offered by pilgrims seeking healing for the specific ailment represented, alongside coins, jewelry, and other valuable items deposited directly into the sacred spring waters as gifts to the goddess in exchange for hoped-for cures. Similar patterns of weapon and treasure deposition in rivers and bogs across the broader Celtic and Germanic world, including the well-documented votive deposits recovered from the River Thames and from Llyn Cerrig Bach in Wales, demonstrate a widespread practice of treating flowing and standing water as a genuine physical conduit to the divine, a boundary permeable enough that valuable, costly objects deliberately, permanently removed from ordinary human use and given specifically to the water itself, constituted a meaningful, legible form of communication with whatever power resided beneath the surface. This distributed, localized pattern of Celtic water veneration, many rivers, many wells, many local goddesses, rather than one single overwhelming national river as in Egypt or India, reflects a genuinely different relationship between geography and religious consciousness. A landscape of scattered agricultural and pastoral communities, each oriented toward its own nearby water source, produced a correspondingly scattered, localized theology of water, in contrast to the singular, centralizing river devotion that could develop only where an entire civilization's survival converged on one dominant waterway. In Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization developed a distinctive relationship to sacred water, shaped directly by the specific, unusual geology of the Yucatán Peninsula, where surface rivers are almost entirely absent and fresh water instead collects in cenotes, natural sinkholes formed by the collapse of limestone bedrock, exposing the water table below in the form of often spectacular, sheer-walled natural wells. With no rivers to worship in the manner of Egypt or India, and no rainfall reliable enough to depend on entirely, the Maya invested their cenotes with extraordinary religious significance, understanding them as direct portals into Xibalba, the underworld already examined in the broader context of Maya afterlife mythology, points of genuine physical and spiritual contact between the visible world and the realm of the dead and the rain gods below. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, extensively dredged by archaeologists beginning in the early 20th century, yielded thousands of objects deliberately deposited into its waters over centuries: gold, jade, ceramics, and, more controversially and now generally accepted based on skeletal analysis, human remains, evidence of the ritual sacrifice of both children and adults offered directly into the water, specifically during periods of drought, when the cenote's connection to Chak, the rain god, made it the most theologically appropriate possible site for petitioning an end to a water crisis with the most valuable offering available: human life given directly back to the water that all life ultimately depended upon. What connects Hapi's annual flood, Ganga's restrained descent, Enki's unpredictable Abzu, the Styx's unbreakable oaths, the Sanzu River's three crossings, the Jordan's double threshold, Sequana's votive spring, and the Maya cenote's drought-driven sacrifice is a recognition every one of these civilizations arrived at independently, through nothing more than sustained attention to the actual physical behavior of water itself. Water is the one substance in ordinary human experience that is simultaneously essential to life and capable of taking it away without warning, that can be crossed, drunk, bathed in, and prayed to, and that never, even for a single moment, holds still. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, observing a river near his home in Ephesus roughly 25 centuries ago, arrived at one of philosophy's most famous and most frequently misunderstood observations: that no one steps into the same river twice, because both the water and the person stepping into it have already changed by the second attempt. Every civilization surveyed here reached, through myth rather than philosophy, toward exactly this same insight, that water was the one element visibly, constantly performing the specific kind of change that boundaries, thresholds, and transformations require, flowing forward and never backward, dividing what it touches from what it does not, capable of washing away what came before precisely because it never remains what it just was. The river did not need to be assigned the job of marking the passage between life and death, purity and sin, one identity and the next. It was already doing that job, visibly, every single day, in the plain sight of every civilization that ever built its life along its banks.